Williams.
And I'm Billy Thomas.
And welcome to another edition of From the Woods Today. You know, we don't have a first-time guest, but we do have a first-time title guest.
Yeah. Yes, we're so excited today, folks. We have Dr. Stephen Price with us, and Dr. Price is a wildlife professor here in our department, and he's been here for a while, but he is now our interim department chair, and we are really excited to have Dr. Price as our interim chair. Dr. Price, so welcome, and in your new role, leading our whole department. We're so excited you stepped up to that challenge.
Well, it's a good opportunity. It's not quite as fun as talking about frogs, which I'll be doing today, but yeah, I'm happy to serve the department.
Yeah, well, we appreciate you. You've done a lot for the department for a long time. You served as our TGS and just have been an outstanding faculty member for so long. So we're really glad that you stepped up. So and
we've already adopted him anyway, in extension.
Yeah. Oh, I know. He's got extension in his blood. I know.
He does.
Earlier, but he's going to be talking about some of these early spring frogs we're going to be hearing real soon, if we're not already.
Oh, we hope.
And then we're also going to have Dr. DJ McNeil on with our Wings of Kentucky, and he's going to be talking about some of the birds that kind of cling to trees. So if you've ever seen birds hanging on trees and you weren't sure what they were, we're going to learn that today with Dr. DJ McNeil. But glad to have you all with us. If you all have questions for either of our guests, please just use the chat function. And if you are a YouTube or podcast listener, please hit us up via email, and you can do that at UK Forestry, at UKY. Sorry.
Forestry.extension at UKY.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, and we'll be happy to respond via email that way. But thank you all for being with us. And Dr. Price, glad to have you with us. And Renee, always a pleasure to be with you.
I love you being here. So, all right, Dr. Price, if you want to go ahead and start sharing your screen.
I will do that. All right. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, sir.
Looks good.
Gotcha.
Okay, well, really happy to be with you, with everybody today to talk about something that I'm really excited about. You know, not a lot of people like late February, early March. You know, it's kind of rainy, but it's one of my favorite times of the year because this is a time of year when we start hearing frogs, when they start emerging from hibernation and start vocalizing at wetlands. So today I'm going to talk to you about some frogs of Kentucky. You will hear some vocalizations, some advertisement calls to these frogs. I'm going to be focusing a lot on species that we hear in like the late winter and early spring, because these are the types of frogs that you'll likely encounter if you're out looking and listening for wildlife. So just a real quick definition of what a frog is. I mean, I think most of you are familiar with that. But a frog is a tailless amphibian that basically have pretty big mouths and long legs that they use for jumping or leaping. There's usually some little bit of confusion on if toads are frogs, but toads are just a specialized type of frogs that have kind of wartier skin, shorter hind limbs, and are better suited for like a terrestrial environment. And of course, frogs and all the frogs here in Kentucky have what we call a tadpole stage. So in the case of our frogs here in Kentucky, the frogs will lay eggs in wetlands, roadside ditches, backwaters of rivers. The eggs will hatch. The tadpoles will hatch out of the eggs and eventually go through metamorphosis into an adult frog. So worldwide, there's 7,811 frogs as of 2 days ago. And this represents most of the diversity in amphibians. 88% of amphibians are frogs, so super diverse group. Now, in Kentucky, we have 20 different species of frogs, and we have two families that are fairly well represented. We have 10 species of tree frogs in the family Hylidae. We have 8 species in the family Ranidae. These are like the true frogs, like bullfrogs. And you can tell the difference between these two groups as the hylid tree frogs tend to have little kind of suction cups or extensions on their digits that help them climb. And the true frogs have like webbed hind feet that makes them well suited for the aquatic environment. A few other species that we have here, and now I'm realizing this doesn't add up to 20, so I must have my numbers wrong. But we have 2 species of toads, American toads and Fowler's toads. We have 1 species called a spadefoot, an eastern spadefoot. Some people call them spadefoot toads. And we have 1 species of narrow-mouthed toad. So those are the frog groups that we have here in Kentucky. Now, the things that's really interesting about frogs is these are vocalizing amphibians. Our other amphibians don't vocalize, but this is a prominent mode of communication for frogs. And there's many different types of vocalizations. What we're going to be focusing primarily on is what we call advertisement vocalizations. And these are the vocalizations given by males to attract females. Females are usually only respond to the calls of males of the same species, and each species has a unique advertisement call. For example, the call of the spring peeper, as you can hear this, sounds like this high-pitched whistle. In the case of female spring peepers, they would respond to this to locate vocalizing males. Now, another really interesting thing about frogs, and especially compared to like birds who tend to vocalize all within the months of like May and June and maybe up into like mid-July, is we see a general timeline or a phenological progression with frog calling. That means that during some times a year, you have species calling, and then they stop calling and other species pick up. And we can kind of group this into different seasons. On this table that I have here, we have various frog species found here in Kentucky. I indicate like the earliest date they've ever been recorded calling in Kentucky. So you can see like the wood frog, earliest calling date is January 15th. And then we can see in blue here like their primary calling months. Okay, so we can see something like the wood frog calls in January and February and maybe into March a little bit, whereas something like the green frog starts calling in late April and generally calls frequently through the months of May through August. So that's what we're looking at here. People who study frogs and use frogs as part of monitoring programs generally break things up into like calling windows. So we have some species that we would consider to be like winter breeders here in Kentucky. And these would be like some of our chorus frogs, a spring peeper, crawfish frog, wood frog. And then we break it up into things that primarily call like in the spring, and this is like April and May. So we have things like pickerel frogs that primarily call during that time of year, things like American toads. And then we have what we'd consider like summer breeding frogs, like bullfrogs and green frogs, and some of our gray tree frogs that primarily breed during this or vocalize during the summer months. So people who do use frogs in monitoring programs, it generally means you have to go out and visit sites like at different times a year. So when you do your monitoring program, you'd start, in the winter time, hopefully to get some of these winter breeding frogs, and you do another survey in April or May to get some spring breeders, and then another survey in June through July. Today, I'm going to just focus on winter breeding frogs because hopefully some of you guys will get out into the field and you'll hear some frogs calling. And the really interesting thing about winter breeding frogs is sometimes they call during the day on warm afternoons. So you can be out hiking around and hear some of these frogs vocalizing. So the first one I'm going to talk about today is the wood frog. And this is a small, about 4-inch long frog that inhabits forests, especially forests that contain little wetlands throughout Kentucky. It's very common in eastern Kentucky, as this map indicates. Places like the Red River Gorge, places on Pine Mountain, very common to find wood frogs there. And then it's kind of scattered within the Knob region and kind of scattered within other parts like the western coal fields. But forests are really important for wood frogs. Now, wood frogs have a prominent dark mask that runs through the eye here. And they are what we consider to be explosive breeders. That means as soon as we get some warm rains in January or February or March, the whole population will come out to the wetland and all the males will call, the females will be there, they'll lay their eggs, and then they might only be vocalizing for like 2 or 3 days. and then they leave the wetland, and that's it for the wood frog's vocalization for the year. Wood frogs kind of sound like a quack of a duck. Oh, so here's the sound of the wood frog. So this is what a typical wood frog breeding site looks like. You can see the forest around it. Now this wetland's kind of frozen, but as soon as there's a little bit of thaw, wood frogs have been known to move through snowy areas to access wetlands to breed. Now, wood frogs are very tolerant to freezing. In fact, they don't hibernate underground. They just hibernate in the leaf litter. And using a combination of urea and glucose, they kind of pump this substance together and forms kind of an antifreeze in their cells. It does not allow them to freeze solid. But if you ever find a wood frog in the winter, which I have, they kind of look like a little frog popsicle. It takes them about 24 hours to completely unthaw, and then they're ready to breed. This is from Lily Cornett Woods in eastern Kentucky, and this is right when wood frogs started breeding. You can hear the choruses, and you can see these wood frogs moving to the wetland here. Now, here's a male, and there's a female underneath her. Males use a grasp called an eclectic grasp to hold on to the females, and then eventually she'll lay eggs. He'll externally fertilize those eggs, but he's a little bit overambitious because they haven't even reached the water yet. And another really neat thing about wood frogs is they just have excellent camouflage. You know, on a forest floor covered in leaves, the wood frog is almost invisible, and this really helps them avoid predators and stay hidden. Our next frog that we'll talk about is the mountain chorus frog. This is a very small frog, about 1 inch long. It's found throughout eastern Kentucky. They start vocalizing in February through May, and they use all kinds of little flooded habitats to breed in. The adults are found on rocky hillsides, but they breed in wet meadows, ephemeral wetlands, roadside ditches. They're not a very descript frog. They often have kind of 2 stripes on their back that look like reverse parentheses, and sometimes a triangular shape between the eyes. But their call is very distinct. It's kind of a rappy, metallic reap. So that's the call of the mountain chorus frog. This is just a picture of an adult here, and you can see kind of those reverse parentheses on its back and that triangular shape between the eye. And again, note the toe pads. It's a member of the tree frog family. Now, a close relative of the mountain chorus frog are these 2 species. And I really won't differentiate between the 2 because the calls are very similar. But we have 2 species of chorus frog in Kentucky. One is the upland chorus frog, and on the map I show, that's seen with the red dots. So they're found throughout the Jackson Purchase and some parts of south central Kentucky. And then we have the western chorus frog, that's the blue dots on here, and they're found throughout the western coal fields and up kind of through Louisville into northern Kentucky, as well as in like the south western part of the state. Again, these guys are small frogs, about 1 inch long. Their dark stripes usually are present on the body. And they're found in open and wooded areas. They breed in fishless wetlands, ditches, flooded fields, and their call sounds like a slow and raspy trill, like running a finger through a comb. And sometimes these are the first frogs that start calling in Kentucky. They'll start in January and they go through like early March. And then after that, they're pretty silent. Oh, here's their call. And to give you an idea about the habitat that's used by upland chorus frogs, this is from McCracken County near Paducah. You can see this flooded field here, and you can hear all the chorus frogs going. I think this was from mid-February a few years ago. Lots of activity and lots of vocalization during the day. Now, these are really small frogs, and they're even smaller when they go through metamorphosis. So the tadpoles will hatch in these flooded areas. They'll go through metamorphosis in like late May. And this is a little baby one, the size of it, on a normal size human finger here. You can see how small those babies are. Another species that's probably one of our most common frogs here in Kentucky is the spring peeper. Again, about an inch long. Their scientific name is Pseudacris crucifer, and crucifer means cross-bearing, and they usually have kind of an X shape on their back. They're found in our forests, and they use forested wetlands to breed. And they have a really high-pitched whistling call that repeats about 1 second intervals. And they usually call from like March to June, but some years we get them as calling as early in January. And I know a few weeks ago, before our recent snowstorm, they were calling in some places in central Kentucky. So they have a really loud call, and the call can carry for like a mile on a night where there's very little wind. This is kind of the chorus of spring peepers here. That's a green frog in the background, but just so you have some idea. So here's a vocalizing spring peeper. All these frogs have vocal sacs that they use to kind of push air through. So our tree frogs have a large vocal sac kind of underneath on the chin area. Our true frogs, like a leopard frog or a bullfrog, have paired vocal sacs on either side of the head. The next one has to be my favorite frog in Kentucky. It's called the crawfish frog. It's kind of a robust but stubby frog with dark round spots on the body. And these are frogs that are common in areas that either are currently or historically tall grass prairies or other native grasslands. They reproduce in wetlands that lack fish, and they call usually between February and March following really heavy rains. And then they'll call for a few days, and that might be all they call throughout the entire season. This is one of our rarest frogs in Kentucky. It's considered a species of greatest conservation need. And different organizations across the country, like the IUCN, list the crawfish frog as near threatened, mostly because the habitats it relies on are becoming rarer and rarer. So they have this deep, loud snore. And these frogs you can hear from quite a distance away too. Here's a pair of crawfish frogs with undergoing amplexus, and their egg masses tend to kind of have this bluish hint to them. And they get their name crawfish frogs because during the non-breeding season, the adults live in burrows dug by crayfish. And so the adult will move down into this burrow. At night, it'll come out, stick its head out, wait for a grasshopper or a bug to come by for it to eat. And during the day, it'll kind of sink down into this burrow. They have a very large skull. And so when something comes down in the burrow to try to get the crawfish frog out, let's say like a snake, they'll use this skull as kind of a shield. They'll fill themselves up with the air, and they become very difficult to remove from their burrow. Using this burrow also makes them really secretive and hard to find. They're almost impossible to find outside of the breeding season because they spend most of their time underground. Another species that you're likely to hear this late winter or spring is the southern leopard frog. This frog is found, through probably about 2/3 of Kentucky. Not very common in eastern Kentucky, although there are some populations around Moorhead. But this is a heavily spotted frog that can be really variable in color, but usually they have round spots on their back. They usually have a white spot in their tympanum, and that's just the ear of the frog, okay? And so they breed in shallow freshwater habitats, ponds, wetlands, and the adults often, will move away from the wetland during the non-breeding season, sometimes found in agricultural fields, sometimes found in forests, places like that. And they have a call that's a chuckle-like guttural trill. What's interesting about this frog is a lot of their breeding occurs between February and May, but if we get big rain events, let's say from hurricane type weather in the fall, they'll have a secondary breeding season in the fall. So here's the southern leopard frog. Some people describe it as rubbing your hand on like a balloon or something. So here's a southern leopard frog, really pretty frog, pointed snout, white spot in the tympanum. And the final frog I'll talk about today is the American toad, which is in the family Bufonidae. We have two species of toads in Kentucky. I'll maybe in a different episode, I'll talk about the other one as it breeds generally in the late spring or summer. But the American toads breed normally in March, sometime as early as late February, March to April. American toads, if you look at these spots on their back, they usually only have one or two warts, these red warts per spot. Our other species of toad has three or more warts. They also have these parotid glands, which basically are areas that they can secrete toxins as an anti-predatory mechanism. American toads use all kinds of different habitats. People find them a lot in their backyards and gardens. They're found in forests too, and farmlands. And they use shallow areas of lakes, ponds, marshes, or other flooded areas to breed. They have a long, high-pitched trill that lasts between 6 and 30 seconds. I used to have a clock in my house that would play frog noises every hour. My wife did not like the American toad call because she said it sounded like an alarm. They lay their egg masses are on these long strings. Okay, so if you ever see egg masses in long strings, it's one of our two species of toads. So here's another picture of the American toad with all these warts and bumps on their back. And by the way, you cannot get warts from touching a toad. As these are all just little glands to secrete toxins or poisons. Some people believe that's so. And as you can see, this next picture is just a vocalizing American toad with that vocal sac being shown. So I've talked about advertisements today, specifically courtship calls, those given by a male to females that have eggs. But there's other types of calls that frogs make. There's territorial calls when a male gives to another male to defend their territory. There's reciprocation calls, although rare. This is given by a female in response to a mating call of a male. The release call is really common. This is given by a male frog when it's flexed, grasped onto by another male, or it's given by a female that doesn't want to breed. And then many frogs also give what's called a distress call. So my last call I'll play today is a distress call. And this is the call made by a frog that's being eaten by something. So this is a distress call of a bullfrog. So frogs give distress calls. The idea behind this is that if a frog makes a call like this, perhaps it can warn other frogs that a predator is nearby, but it can also create a situation where it attracts maybe mammals like raccoons or possums to the scene of this incident. And that predator that's trying to eat the frog will then move away. Or in some cases, the predator is already swallowing the frog when they're giving this distress call. And then let's say a fox or raccoon comes in, gets the snake that's trying to swallow the frog, and the frog may be able to escape and get away. Last thing I want to say is there's just a lot of really great frog resources out there. The USGS has a really good website where you can pick different states, learn your frog calls, take some frog quizzes. But there's a lot of other great sources out there too to learn your frog calls. So on that, I'll end my presentation.
Feeling froggy.
Right. I'm telling you, that one frog, it was like, I would not have thought that that was a frog.
Yeah.
I know we did that one time when we just had the radio show, we were asking people what that was, and people were like, I have no idea. I wouldn't have had a clue.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, well, you can also make a frog give a distress call too. So if you grasp onto them and hold them, I guess it's the same feeling as if they were being grabbed onto by a snake. So that frog in that recording was a bullfrog that we were holding on to, and it was giving the distress call.
Oh.
I really enjoyed the presentation,
Me
and I'll
too.
encourage all of our viewers, our woodland owners out there, get out there and check out your property.
Mhm.
Over the years, Dr. Price, a lot of our woodland owners have put in vernal ponds and other kind of
Hmm.
shallow water places, as kind of conservation practices. And I'll
Yeah,
tell you, I've seen some really great breeding, happening in those sites. So I would
yeah.
encourage everybody to get out and check those out.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear what people find in their ponds, and that's can be a really important conservation measure for a lot of these amphibians. They seem to be able to colonize them fast, so that's a really good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was a question. They wanted to know if there was an app to ID Kentucky frogs.
Well, if you go to the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources webpage, they do have kind of a frog ID guide with some recorded calls. So that's something that you may be able to check out, but I'm not aware of any app at this point. Yeah.
Sounds like something we need to do.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Wait, was there one more popped in?
One just popped in. Yeah. Has Dr. Price seen a different species represented in natural wetlands versus restored wetlands under an NRCS wetland reserve program?
Well, so I haven't really looked at wetlands under that reserve program, but I have done some work with natural and restored wetlands, especially on
Mhm.
mine lands in Kentucky and West Virginia. And these mine lands were kind of adjacent to like national and state forests and things like that. So there's a little bit of context at play here. But generally, when a wetland is created or restored, and as long as it's not too deep and does not support fish, because fish really like to eat amphibians. That's the thing. So if you have fish, you might get bullfrogs and a few other things, but you won't see a lot of diversity. But as long as that wetland's shallow, has good vegetation, we've seen high success rates with frogs being able to colonize these areas. In fact, some of our newest wetlands up at Pine Mountain that were created like 2 years before we did our surveys had higher species richness, more frog species than some of our sites located on the Daniel Boone. So, yeah.
Dr. Price, real quick, could you show your last slide one more time for folks? They wanted to grab some of those URLs.
Yeah, let me
I would and take a screenshot, folks, and it'll give you a chance to capture those, and you can plug them in later.
yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I'll keep it up here for a minute.
Yeah, and this is such a great time for folks to get out and be checking out their woods. We're getting
Mhm.
ready for leaf out, but you can still see really well right now what's going
Hmm.
on. So
So we did
Yeah.
have another question. Besides habitat, are frogs under pressure? I guess from
yeah,
extinction. Is that what they're
maybe
saying?
habitat loss
Habitat
and other
loss?
things, or
I'm not
Yeah.
100%.
So I
population.
guess the question is, have some frog species maybe seen population declines? And in Kentucky, I would say there's some species that have declined. The crawfish frog being one of them. We have a species called northern leopard frog in kind of north central bluegrass of Kentucky, and their numbers have really decreased since like the 1970s, especially on the southern range limit of that. For example, they used to be found in Fayette and Jessamine counties here, but they are no longer found in these areas. And so we're not really sure why that decline has happened, but it has. Um, and there's some of our tree frogs, especially in Western Kentucky, are rare. But most of the reason why frogs in Kentucky, at least, have declined is due to changes in habitat and the removal or draining of these shallow water wetlands.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
All right, folks, you got
Well,
anything else for Dr. Price? He's going to have to jump off, but
yeah, a
if you
lot of
do
good
have,
questions.
yeah, if you do have other questions, still get them in, and we can get up with Dr. Price and get those responses to you later. But
He has to jump off and get to class, but we greatly
Yeah.
appreciate you
yes,
joining us for the first part of it. And I know we'll have you back on.
All
yeah,
right.
yes,
Well,
yes. And thanks for your leadership of our department, Dr. Price. Really
Exactly.
appreciate it.
Appreciate it so much.
okay.
All
We'll
right.
see
Take
you
care.
guys.
Thanks. Bye.
Man, that was good, Renee.
I loved
I
it.
really,
Yeah. And some of those frogs, I'm like, oh, yeah, I remember that. And then other ones, I'm like, I wouldn't even have thought that was a
I
frog.
know it's like otherworldly sounds. I mean, gosh, I love this show. We have so many entertaining and interesting guests and
We
topics.
try. We try to have, full
I know.
gamut of different
I
things.
love it. I always feel like I'm learning stuff here, like every show.
Definitely,
It's great.
definitely. And speaking of learning, we now
Yes, let's keep
have,
it going.
yes, Dr. DJ McNeil. He has a video for us on clinging birds. And I was like, first of all, I was like, clingy birds? It's like, they mean they just want to hug you too much, but we're going to learn more about that if you want to go ahead and get that
All
started.
right, I'll get that shared.
Okay, folks, welcome to this month's Wings of Kentucky. This month, we're going to talk about a fun group, Kentucky's bark clinging birds. Now, you may be wondering why I'm not just referring to the bark clinging birds as woodpeckers. And in a sense, they are oftentimes pecking wood, but there's a little bit more to it than that, especially from a taxonomic perspective. So when I say bark clinging birds, I'm referring to any bird that spends much of its time clinging to the bark of a tree. So in Kentucky, that's going to be generally 2 avian orders and 4 avian families. So 2 avian orders are piciforms, which are the woodpeckers, such as this lovely pileated woodpecker here, and then the passeriforms, which are the perching birds or the songbirds. And within the passeriforms, sometimes called the passerines for short, we've got 3 families of bark clinging birds. Sitidae, which are the nuthatches, we're going to see several members of this family. Perthidae, which are the creepers, of which North America has just 1 species, and it's fairly common in Kentucky, especially in the winter. And 1 member of Parulidae, which is this is a black and white warbler. It's the only sort of common bark clinging wood warbler that we have here in Kentucky. Some others, like the black-throated blue warbler, will occasionally cling to bark, but none nearly as famously or as often as the black and white warbler, which will be the bird that we end today with. And let me actually unshare very briefly, make sure that I've shared my sound here, because there are a lot of sounds in today. So share again. Yes, share sound. Good. Glad I double checked on that. Okay, so let us return to this discussion. We're going to start with the piciforms, and we're going to work through all of Kentucky's common woodpeckers, how to sex them, for some of them, how to age them, how to identify them visually, and for most species, how to identify them with multiple different kinds of vocalization. Well, of course, we have to start with a favorite of mine, the downy woodpecker. It's really hard not to just love the downy woodpecker. It's our smallest woodpecker, a very small, cute little guy or gal, as the case may be. And the species is relatively straightforward to identify. Again, very small bird, generally black and white color scheme. The male, and I've got the males on the left for this entire thing today. The males have a little red spot on the nape. The female does not have a red spot on the nape. She's got a fully white back of the head there. Relatively complex pattern on the head. We've got a malar stripe. Again, aside from the red spot, the male and female are identical. A little malar stripe. We've got this dark auricular that kind of forms a band toward the back of the head. A dark crown, white supercilium, this sort of white boundary on the malar and auricular, and a white throat, white underparts. We've got a white bar along the mantle that kind of is very conspicuous in the back, and the wings are black and white spotted that in such a way that the spots almost form wing bars or banding on the wings. Now, take a look at the bill. Very small in the downy woodpecker. We've got these nasal feathers that in some individuals can cover up much of the bill barely protruding past. But either way, we see that the bill is quite petite in relation to the head, and that's going to be a very helpful characteristic for discerning from the hairy woodpecker. Vocally, not too bad. It is a descending whinny. And here's a spectrogram. We're going to see a bunch of these spectrograms today. Here is the frequency on our y-axis, and this is time. So you can see that this is a whinny or a trill, and you can see it descend. So let's listen to that song. I've got 2 examples here, and listen for that descent at the end. Here's a different individual, if I can get it. It also produces a single soft pick. And the drumming is a soft, rapid trill. Now, this fairly unremarkable drumming is something we're going to see in a bunch of the woodpeckers today. And I'm going to play you the drums of all the woodpeckers, but I won't start pointing out differences until we get to the small number of them that can be identified easily by their drums. Now, really experienced birders can tell some of these apart, but that's not me. So here's the drum of the downy woodpecker. So let's move along to the hairy woodpecker. Now you'll notice visually it is almost identical to the downy woodpecker. We've got the male on the left, again, red spot on the nape, female lacking that red spot. The big thing that we can use to discern these two woodpeckers from the downy woodpecker, well, there's a couple things. Size for one, but that's really difficult to depict with a photo. The really useful thing is the proportion of the bill. So look at the size of this bill. The bill itself is pretty much the same size as the skull, which is a very helpful trait. Look at this gigantic bill sticking out of that hairy woodpecker. Now, the song and call and drumming bear some resemblance to the downy woodpecker, but there's a key difference. Remember that whinny or that trill on the downy woodpecker descended at the end, or the downy woodpecker song goes down. The hairy woodpecker, which is much shriller, more of a dry, kind of angry sounding rattle, is basically a flat trill, does not descend at the end. So let's listen to that. Does not descend at the end. It also produces a pick call, but it sounds much harsher than the downy woodpecker. And it has a rapid drumming that does not have a really clear tempo that changes like the yellow-bellied sapsucker, doesn't trail off at the end like the pileated, just a standard kind of woodpecker drum. Now let's compare that downy woodpecker side by side. Again, that downy with that short little bill versus that hairy where the bill is essentially the same size as the skull. The downy song goes down at the end. Whereas the hairy woodpecker song does not go down at the end. Moving on, the red-bellied woodpecker. This is a lovely bird, arguably poorly named. You can sort of see in this image of the male where it gets the term red-bellied woodpecker. Across the Western Hemisphere, there are actually a lot of woodpeckers that have this sort of buffy underparts, black and white barred back, and some amount of red or orange on the head. So it's not totally absurd that it would be called the red-bellied woodpecker because many of them don't have a reddish hue to the belly, but like this female here, no real apparent red at all. So it's a bird that gets complained about in terms of the name because really it should be called, at least in terms of our widespread North American woodpeckers, maybe like the red-naped woodpecker or red-capped woodpecker, I'm not sure. But the male shown on the left here basically has red from the base of his bill all the way up the head, down the nape, and even into the mantle a little bit. Where the female just has red on the back of her head, her crown and forecrown are basically either going to be gray or some buff color. But otherwise, fairly straightforward identification of the red-bellied woodpecker. Visually speaking. Now, vocally, not too bad either. The species produces a very rich whir, whir song, which I'll play first. And the call is a series of either choke, 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 or cheek, cheek, cheek. And of course, the drumming. Next up, we have the red-headed woodpecker. Now, this one I would argue is well named. It's a fairly straightforward identification with a fully red head. The back and upper parts are basically completely black with the exception of the rump and the secondary flight feathers, and the underparts are like a nice clean white, really straightforward identification. And it's important to note this color scheme we see here is present in both the male and the female. They're not easily discernible visually. But we often, especially later in the summer, we get these young juvenile birds that have either a brown head or some amount of red feathers mixed in. There's a red feather there, maybe one there. And there's dark tips on the secondary flight feathers. But again, we've got a dark back, we got white secondaries, and we've got a sort of a solid colored head and plain underparts. Relatively straightforward identification. And again, remember that bill size. This is more similar to what we saw with the hairy woodpecker and big long bill versus that short little bill in our downy woodpecker. So juvenile red-headed woodpecker, largely the same color scheme as the adult red-headed woodpecker minus the namesake red head. So let's take a listen to some vocalizations. I'm going to play you this rattle call first. They do this quite a lot. It's it's somewhat of a dry rattle. Whoa. I actually think, and I believe Dr. Price will have a herpetology either before or after this Wings of Kentucky. I think that this rattle call in many cases can sound like an eastern gray tree frog. It kind of reminds me of the call of a raccoon as well. Let's listen to that rattle call again. Now, the call that they're, I think, a bit better known for is this, I don't know if it's this song per se, but it is not very song-like, but if it's used as a song, they have a shrill, loud scream that they often do, which I will play for you now. And of course, the drumming. Next up, we have the yellow-bellied sapsucker. This is a fun bird, and it's called the yellow-bellied sapsucker, but they don't always have a yellow belly, and even if they have yellow underparts, it's pretty vague, and it's possible that they technically always have some amount of yellow. I'm not really sure, but I can tell you this, you're often not going to see much of a yellow belly. This here in the middle is a female. She's the yellowest of the three here. This male has a little hint of yellow like under the black bib. This juvenile here, I mean, it has some hints of yellow, but it's pretty, I don't know, subtle. So we've got the male, the female, and the juvenile shown here. The male has a red forecrown and a red throat. The female has the red forecrown and a white throat, and the juvenile may or may not lack any amount of this red. But one thing that's really distinctive about the yellow-bellied sapsucker, in addition to being like a mottled, kind of dirty-looking woodpecker, there's one plumage characteristic that is always there for you with the sapsucker, no matter what. It never forsakes you. And that is this white patch on the shoulder here. That is always present. The yellow-bellied sapsucker never lacks that white shoulder, no matter which of these plumages you see, which is very convenient for identifying this surprisingly variable bird. Now, we mostly see our yellow-bellied sapsuckers here in Kentucky. In the wintertime, I take my ornithology class out to the Arboretum pretty regularly, and we see multiple yellow-bellied sapsuckers each time we visit the Arboretum for a class trip. Now, in addition to spotting these woodpeckers, which is not difficult to do because they're a decent-sized woodpecker, they have a variety of vocalizations that make them easy to identify. Now, in the breeding season, if you go up north, there's a lot of these birds, you can hear this screaming song. I believe it's primarily used as a song, a shrill, squeaky series of screams. But what we're going to hear in Kentucky most of the time is the mew call, and they produce it fairly often. It sounds like a cat meowing. It's a soft, nasally mew. Now, one thing that's cool about the yellow-bellied sapsucker is it's one of the species where the drumming is incredibly reliable for identification. So these other woodpeckers essentially produce a trill with their drumming, but the yellow-bellied sapsucker actually produces a erratic series of drums, basically striking the wood with their bill in a way that is, again, erratic and slowing down toward the end. So let's listen to that erratic and slowing drumming. Here's a slightly longer one. Moving on, the northern flicker. This is a fun woodpecker, and it was actually kind of difficult to find nice images of the bird clinging to wood. They are indeed woodpeckers, but they behave quite differently than a lot of woodpeckers do. For one, they, instead of clinging to the side of a tree like this individual is, they spend much of their time on lateral branches like a passerine, or even spending time on the ground. In fact, it gets its name because it sits on the ground oftentimes, flicking its tongue in and out of ant colonies and pulling out ants with its long, sticky tongue with a barbed tip. Very cool bird, visually unmistakable. We have the so-called yellow shafted subspecies here, where the shafts and undersides of the feathers are a yellowish color. Both the male here and the female here have this black bib, these very nice black spots on the breast and underparts, a basically brown and black barred back. And on both sexes, we have a face that's this like buffy salmon color with a gray nape and a little red nape spot present on both the male and the female. The main plumage difference between the male and the female is the male has a little black mustache and the female does not. Very beautiful woodpecker, unmistakable. Now, vocally, some find the northern flicker to be a little bit tricky. So we've got the drumming, which is certainly tricky. I would not personally use it to identify the species. Here's that drumming. The call, which in contrast to the drumming is very easy, is a skew or a clear. Now, it's the song that people trip up with. It is a long, drawn out, wick, 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 wick. Now, that's not too difficult on its own, but the next bird we're going to study, the pileated woodpecker, is also a long, drawn-out series of calls, and many find the two to be confusing. In fact, I spent time on the website Xenocanto, which is a citizen science platform for loading up bird vocalizations, and I spent a lot of time on there trying to find just the perfect calls to share with you all today. And a bunch of the northern flickers were misidentified as pileated woodpeckers and vice versa. So speaking of that pileated woodpecker, this is easily our most striking woodpecker. It's definitely our largest. The opposite of our downy woodpecker. These guys are just beastly. They're about the size of an American crow. Really unmistakable, large, mostly black bird with white markings on the wings that are hard to see when the wings are folded, but big white patches on the wings when they're open. This striking black and white striped head, and of course the just absolutely classic large crest. The male's crest basically goes from the base of the bill all the way to the back, forms this nice mohawk. The female, she has a dark forecrown. Her sort of colored crest doesn't start till a little bit farther back on the head. And both sexes have a mustache, but the male has a red mustache and the female has a black mustache. Just an incredible bird. Now, vocally, I would say they present a challenge because that call is a series of kick, 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 kick calls that can resemble a flicker. We're going to listen to them side by side in a moment. It's usually shorter. I find it to be more powerful, and it kind of trails off at the end. The drumming is also fairly straightforward, and I think a species that can be identified readily from its drumming. It's because the drumming also trails off at the end and is very powerful sounding. Now let's compare the song of the flicker and the pileated woodpecker. So the flicker is that series of wick, 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 that sort of is weaker and higher pitched and longer. Now let's listen to that pileated woodpecker, which is shorter, lower pitched, and more powerful sounding. Okay, moving on. We're moving out of the piciforms and into the passeriforms, the passerines. And the first is the white-breasted nuthatch. Beautiful bird, this blue-gray back with this very intricately patterned secondaries and tertiary feathers. We've got this sort of dark wing bar here, again, right against this blue-gray back. White breast, white belly. If you see it in the right angle, we've got almost this chocolatey brown undertail coverts, a very plain white face, and then on the male, we have a black cap and a black nape, and on the female, we have a dark gray cap and nape. Now, woodpeckers often move on the side of a tree, right? But they can only really go up the tree, at least with any level of efficiency. Nuthatches can go up the tree just like a woodpecker, but they can also go down the tree, which is why you often see them clinging to the side of a tree with their head facing down, much like these two birds here. Now, vocally, pretty distinct. It has a song and a call. The song of the white-breasted nuthatch is a loose, nasally trill. Let's listen to that one more time here. Now that nasally quality is also present in the species song, or the call, which it produces often, which is a nasally eh, eh, eh. Okay, next up we have the red-breasted nuthatch. Now the red-breasted nuthatch is a species that we only see in Kentucky pretty much in the winter time. I often see them out at, of course, I'm here in Lexington, our Jacobson Park, where there's a stand of planted pines. And of course, as a northern bird, the red-breasted nuthatch is very commonly associated with conifer trees, especially pines and spruces. The male, which I have here on the left, much like the white-breasted nuthatch, is a species where we've got a brighter and more boldly colored male, where blacks are replaced with sort of dark grays in the female. Just like the white-breasted nuthatch, we've got a blue-gray back, but it's actually, in my opinion, bluer on the red-breasted nuthatch. We've got some amount of a reddish rufous underparts that may or may not bleed up into the throat. The male, again, being darker than the female. And the thing that never, ever forsakes you with this species is, again, you've got a dark cap and nape, just like on the white-breasted nuthatch, but we also have this dark eye line that is not present in the white-breasted nuthatch. So you just look for that white eye line, or this dark eye line with a white supercilium, instead of that plain face, gives it away as a red-breasted nuthatch every time. Now, the vocalizations, this is one of my favorite of the vocalizations we're going to cover today. It sounds like a teeny tiny little car honking its horn, going meep, meep, meep. Let's listen to that one more time. It's just so fun. And that's the red-breasted nuthatch. Moving on, and I believe this is the last member of Citidae we're going to cover today, is the brown-headed nuthatch. And as far as I know, the sexes are basically the same. Straightforward identification. Again, these nuthatches often have this blue-gray back, and the brown-headed is no exception. But of course, it's got a brown head, unlike the white-breasted nuthatch and red-breasted nuthatch. Still a very plain face. We don't have like a very obvious dark supercilium or eye line with a pale supercilium like we saw on the red-breasted. And again, very different from the white-breasted. One thing that's interesting about this species is in Kentucky, it's very limited in its distribution, mostly to southern Kentucky and almost exclusively to areas that have the southern pines, loblolly, longleaf, shortleaf, things like that. Pretty much the only place you can find the brown-headed nuthatch in Kentucky. Vocally, it's another fun one. Produces this sort of squeaky toy noise. Sounds like a dog playing with a squeaky toy. And the way that I remember the brown-headed nuthatch, and I don't often see people describing it this way, but it's helped me. It's like asking like kids, like, who wants cookies or who wants cake? And they say, we do, we do, we do. So listen for it saying we do, or something similar to that. With the quality of a dog squeaky toy. So here we go. And they produce these calls a lot. Basically, anytime they're getting excited in a family group, they're producing these squeaky toy calls. Okay, just two more species. Now we've got Kurthidae, the brown creeper. And again, with this species, as far as I know, the sexes are identical. There could be some sort of subtle trick that I've never learned, but I've never heard anyone describe a good way to sex the brown creeper. There are two different color morphs, but they're kind of hard to tell apart. There's a gray morph or a brown morph and a red morph. And pretty similar. What you need to know about this species is it's pale below, like some of the nuthatches, has a pale supercilium, but the back and the wings are this like intricately patterned and heavily mottled brown, buff, and tan plumage that allows the bird to blend right in with the trunk of a tree. When you see the bird from the side, we've also got this very long, very skinny, decurved bill. It is not a bird that's going to be doing a lot of pecking. It's not going to be prying bark off the tree. It is primarily going to use that delicate little bill to slide down into and between the bark on the tree and find small insects, spiders, things like that. Let's listen to the lovely song of the brown creeper, this high-pitched, thin little song. The mnemonic that I use is some variation on springtime is finally here. So it has this introductory note, which you see spring, and then this jumble, which for me, I do springtime is finally here. It's not a great mnemonic because I also use it and many others also use it for the eastern meadowlark, but I don't think you're likely to confuse them. It's a very high-pitched song. It's a very feeble song. It's very weak, quiet, and very quiet little musical song. Very whistly. Okay, the last one we're going to cover here, Parulidae, is the black and white warbler. Now, unlike the brown creeper, which we see in the wintertime quite a bit, we don't really see a lot of black and white warblers in the winter. Most of these guys head south. The species does winter throughout the southern United States, be it further south in Kentucky, but it's more of a neotropical migrant. So a lot of these birds are down in Central America for the winter time. But when they're here in the breeding season, it's a cool bird. It's a wood warbler, and unlike most wood warblers, it loves to cling to the side of a tree. Just incredibly striking plumage, hard to mistake it for anything else. We've got the male here. We've got basically black wings. We've got a white stripe going down the tertials and into the secondaries, two white wing bars and black and white stripes on the mantle. On both sexes, we have some amount of streaking on the flanks and on the sides of the breast. And on the face, we've got a black and white crown, a black auricular mask, and a black throat on the male. The female essentially has all these same plumage characteristics, but her much less extensive markings on the auricular and a pale throat, and all of the other markings are just tending toward white. And even some females have a little bit of a brown or cinnamon in the flanks. Vocally, very straightforward. It is a repeated wheezy, 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 or a squeaky wheel going around and around? I think we're going to leave it at that for this Wings of Kentucky. Thanks for joining me to discuss some of Kentucky's bark clinging birds. Get out there, go see if you can find some birds, maybe at your local park, local state forest, local wildlife management area, etc. And I'll be looking forward to the next Wings of Kentucky. In the meantime, stay warm and happy birding.
Well, that was neat. I really love, I mean, this show, they were both very, very good. I don't see how they remember all of that between both of them. That was a lot of different frogs, a lot of different birds. It was just amazing.
I love it. I feel like we have prepared people to go out into the
Exactly.
woodlands this spring and kind of know what's happening, right?
Exactly.
With the frogs and birds that they might see on the trees. Yeah, big thanks to both Dr. Price and Dr. McNeil.
Hmm.
We're fortunate to have them here in our department. They do great work and a
Yeah.
lot of cool research as well. But it was fun learning about frogs and birds.
It really was.
I
It
loved it.
really was. So, sometimes we get topics that come in, and I believe the frog one was actually is like, I'd like to hear something about frogs. So, if you have a topic that you want to know more about, as long as it has something to do with forests or woodlands, we will definitely be able to maybe promote that. So let us know. You can go to fromthewoodstoday.com, and there's a little button there that you can click a survey, and you can give us your topic ideas. Or, Billy, if they find something in their woods, they're like, what is this? They can take a
Right.
picture and send it to us.
Yeah, no doubt. And remember, folks, if you're seeing something, there's a good chance others are kind of maybe curious about it as well. So help out your neighbors and your fellow woodland owners and fellow passionate people about our forests and natural resources, and let us know what you're seeing that's causing you a little scratch your head.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So until then, we will see you all next week. So take care.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
From the woods today. From the woods today.